Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Congregational Library's talk for today. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. And I very much welcome you to today's virtual book talk, Insensible of Boundaries, Studies in Mary Ann Shadd Cary with Dr. Kristin Moriah. So thank you so much, Kristin, for being with us today. To begin, I want to acknowledge the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, a homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. Juneteenth is still a federal holiday here in the United States, honoring the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. It commemorates the anniversary of the order proclaiming freedom for enslaved people in Texas on June 19, 1865, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in states like Texas, which had rebelled against the United States. Enslaved people fought hard and at great risk for their emancipation, and we remember them on this day. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England City Streets project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. And I do hope you'll check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do for news and forthcoming events. And without further ado, our speaker today is Dr. Kristin Moriah, Assistant Professor of African American Literary Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She is the editor of this fantastic book, Insensible of Boundaries, Studies in Mary Ann Shadd Cary, the first collection of scholarly essays about a radical Black feminist editor and activist, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Her work has been supported by fellowships from the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada, the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia, and the Harry Ransom Center. Her work has appeared in American Quarterly, TER, PAJ, Early American Literature, Theatre Research in Canada, Performance Matters, and Sounding Out. Dr. Moriah, thanks so much for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining me today for this June 19th lecture. It's been an honor and a pleasure preparing for it, and also just to be here with you. I'm speaking to you today from the Greater Toronto Area, specifically the traditional treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788, and the Williams Treaties of 1923. I'm grateful to be able to live on these lands and to work here and form relationships that contribute to a sense of reconciliation. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. I owe a great deal of thanks to Lauren Hibbert for her work organizing the promotion of this talk and to the many other staff members behind the scenes who helped to ensure that this talk ran smoothly. And of course, I would like to thank Kyle Roberts, the director of the Congregational Library and Archives, for inviting me to give this lecture and for your enthusiasm for Insensible of Boundaries, Studies in Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Your support is incredibly gratifying to all of the contributors. My talk today is based in part on the work found in that volume, but I've also taken the opportunity to move in new directions. If you're here today, you probably already know that Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a trailblazing 19th century Black feminist. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was born in Wilmington, Delaware in 1823 at a time when owning Black Americans was still legal within the state and a driving force in its economy. Her parents, Abraham Doris Shadd and Harriet Burton Parnell, were born free, but they did not take their freedom lightly. The Shadds were conductors on the Underground Railroad and active members of the abolitionist movement. And their eldest daughter, Mary Ann, described her father, Abraham D. Shadd, as the chief brakeman on the Delaware Underground Railroad. Education was a central value for the Shadd family, and they fought to ensure that each of their 13 children had the opportunity to attend school. The Shadds left the state of Delaware when educating Black children became illegal there, settling in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Abolitionist activism and the importance of education were lessons that the Shadd children took to heart. 6 years after leaving Delaware at the age of 16, Mary Ann Shadd would eventually become a teacher. She taught at schools in Pennsylvania, New York, Washington, D.C., and Canada West, and she began writing and participating in Black political discourse at an early age. Her determination to write and participate in literary discourses was intense. When she was only 25 years old, her letters to Frederick Douglass were published in the North Star. Like her father, Mary Ann Shadd Cary was an active participant in the colored conventions movement, a rarity for Black women in the 19th century. As a young activist, she attended the first American Convention of Colored Freemen held in Toronto at St. Lawrence Hall in 1851. And soon after, Mary Ann published A Plea for Emigration, a document that firmly established her support for the project of Black migration to Canada in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Mary Ann Shadd Cary eventually immigrated to Windsor, Ontario. She founded the Provincial Freeman newspaper in 1853, becoming the first Black woman editor and publisher in North America. And through the Provincial Freeman, she fostered a critical forum for intellectual and political exchange across borders in Black communities. It remains one of the most important records of early Black life in Canada and a testament to the broad spectrum of Black politics and print in North America. It also established Shadd as a counterpoint to canonical writers like Susanna Moodie, a white Canadian settler whose 1851 memoir, Roughing It in the Bush, Life in Canada, became emblematic of 19th century Canadian women's writing. Today, she's the woman of the hour. In October 9th, 2023, we marked the beginning of the 200th anniversary of her birth, and the celebrations are ongoing, including the recent unveiling of a postage stamp in her honor. While the current celebrations of her 200th birthday have resulted in a flourish of activities, her exceptional achievements have not gone unnoticed by major North American institutions. Since 1994, she has been officially recognized as a person of historical significance by the Government of Canada. In 1998, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in the United States. An overview of Shadd Cary's legacy and life greets visitors as they enter the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., for now, one of her hometowns. Her house on W Street in Northwest Washington, D.C. is a National Historic Landmark. In Wilmington, Delaware, a post office has been named after her. And until recently, if you traveled to Ottawa, you could view a giant photograph of Shadd Cary outside of the National Gallery of Canada in Deanna Bowen's massive installation, The Black Canadians, after Cook. Large outdoor murals of Shadd Cary have also been mounted in Toronto and Washington, D.C. As a progressive journalist and staunch abolitionist and political activist, Mary Ann Shadd Cary pushed the boundaries of expectations for Black women in the 19th century in ways that are almost too numerous to list. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a notable member of the class of Black feminist intellectuals that would become known as race women. Brittany Cooper explains that race women explicitly fashioned for themselves a public duty to serve their people through diligent and careful intellectual work and attention to proving the intellectual character of the race. However, in Shadd Cary's day, that public duty was not to include the activities she became known for, like public speaking and writing. Carla Peterson notes that Shadd Cary's speeches were often perceived not only as pertinent, but impertinent, and her unfeminine speaking style led even those who appreciated the substance of her lectures to admit her lack of eloquence, to label her delivery as nervous and hurried. Writing about her speech at the Philadelphia Colored Convention of 1855, a reporter from the British Banner claimed that had Miss Shadd not had in her bosom more the male than that of the female heart, she would have felt ashamed of her position and hastened to hide herself amid the soft obscurities of her own sex. Today, I'll focus on Mary Ann Shadd Cary's knack for troubling categories like race woman, or what I would like to term her queerness. In this talk, I argue that we can find traces of Shadd Cary's queer Black feminism in the archives and in her editorial practices. In evoking the term queer here, I deliberately reference E. Patrick Johnson's etymology of the term queer as a meaning queer, also opposite of straight, odd, or slightly off kilter, from the African American vernacular for queer, sometimes homophobic in usage, but always denotes excess and capable of being contained within conventional categories of being, and also one who thinks and feels and sometimes acts up, committed to racial struggle against all forms of oppression, racial, sexual, gender, class, religious, etc., or one for whom sexual and gender identities always already intersect with racial subjectivity. I argue that Mary Ann Shadd Cary's steadfast refusal to be bound by conventional gender norms and her keen ability to use loopholes to evade gender discrimination made her a queer Black feminist figure. One of the most telling aspects of her queerness for me is the way that Shadd Cary's desire to push against gendered boundaries bled into her domestic life. Shadd Cary's contentious relationship with the cult of domesticity is taken up by scholars like Ji-Won Wu, R.J. Boutelle, and Marlis Whitley in Insensible of Boundaries in Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Studies in Mary Ann Shadd Cary. I myself have long been struck by a few lines in Jane Rhodes' biography, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, The Black Press and Protest in the 19th Century. They're passing comments, easy to skip over. But according to Jane Rhodes, Mary Ann Shadd Cary and her husband Thomas Cary maintained separate households and in fact never lived together for an extended period of time, despite having 2 children. Their relationship remains a mystery. Rhodes says we know virtually nothing about the nature of their courtship and marriage. Only a few letters from Thomas Cary remain to provide any insight into this companionate relationship. She explains that Thomas kept his home in Toronto while Mary Ann lived in Chatham, but they traveled frequently between the 2 residences to be together when they could. This might cause those familiar with how often Shadd Cary traveled to participate in colored conventions and to promote the Provincial Freeman to give pause. Rhodes tells us that for some, the Cary's marriage was an example of a relationship that defied 19th century gender conventions because Mary Ann continued her active public career with her husband's support and approval. It seems that neither Mary Ann or Thomas were interested in the kind of conventional marriage that would have bolstered anti-slavery discourses about Black families and Black freedom. The fact of the practical and ongoing separation can lead us into new ways of thinking about Shadd Cary's feminism. Like Rhodes and others in my archival research, I've been struck by the tone of the letters between Shadd Cary and Thomas Cary. In fact, my research on Mary Ann Shadd Cary has been shaped by my specific interest in the Archives Ontario collection of her papers. I was lucky enough to be able to visit Archives Ontario in February 2022 and see that material in person. I was one of the first people to view that material in the Archives Ontario reading room. And the collection is still stunning. I get a thrill thinking about holding her letters and lecture notes, the very paper she worked with her own hands. There was no other collection like it in Canada. When I first visited Archives Ontario to view the papers, I was actually looking for gossip that someone might have missed. I imagined that a woman like Shadd Cary would be the sender and recipient of incredible pieces of prose, particularly with her romantic partner. What I found instead were fairly unexciting accounts of home life and child rearing between 2 people who functioned rather well independently. Thomas Cary was a barber, not a passionate writer. And in the words of Jane Rhodes, their letters reveal the affection and respect the 2 felt for each other, although there was very little of the romance or thinly veiled eroticism often found in Victoria-era correspondence. Mary Ann and Thomas's separate living arrangements are even more striking when we consider the lack of emphasis on domesticity that we find in the pages of Mary Ann Shadd Cary's newspaper, The Provincial Freeman. Daniel Urquhart and Nathan Smith, my colleagues at Mackenzie House Museum in Toronto, recently told me about a short article about gender and family, potentially written by William Lyon Mackenzie, the famed Toronto journalist and politician, and also a contemporary of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. That article, entitled Look Out Boys, was reprinted in Shadd Cary's Provincial Freeman on May 24, 1856. In Look Out Boys, young men are warned that flounces are of no consequence when looking for a wife, because a pretty face will grow old. The sweet smile of the first will give way to the scowl of the termagant, and the neat form will be pinched into calico. Instead, male readers are urged to find one whose mind is right and then pitch in. I would like to suggest that Mary Ann Shadd Cary's background in education and politics and her feminist editorial practices are aligned with her decision to reprint this article. It's the closest, almost, I think, the closest we get to any real articulation or any piece that's published in the Provincial Freeman that fully articulates her belief in the division of domestic labor, her resistance to traditional marriage, and her rejection of gender norms, like the performance of femininity. She didn't have to be that way. My investigation into Mary Ann Shadd Cary's queerness is also gnawed in part to an article written by William J. Wilson, also known as the Ethiop. A frequent contributor to the North Star, Wilson has also been credited as a contributing writer for the opening speech of the famed 1855 Colored Convention in Philadelphia. In a piece entitled My Dear Cousin M, published in the North Star on November 9th, Wilson describes some of the events of the 1855 Colored Convention and focuses on Mary Ann Shadd Cary, a daughter of Pennsylvania, her speech and appearance. He explains that Miss Shadd is rather tall, but of fine physical organization, wholly feminine in appearance and demeanor, has a well-molded head set upon a rather slender neck, which gives her, when erect or speaking animatedly, what white folks would say is a very saucy look. An anecdote of her will best illustrate this, he claims. In New York and coming down Broadway at a time when colored women scarcely dared to think of riding the stages, Miss Shadd threw up her head, gave one look and a wave of her hand. There was such an air of impressive command that the huge, coarse, ruffianly driver, who had been known to refuse colored ladies as though suddenly seized with paralysis, reined up to the curb, and she entered, and without hindrance rode to the end of her journey. The Ethiop goes on to note that Miss Shadd's eyes are small and penetrating and fairly flash when she is speaking. Her ideas seem to flow so fast that she at times hesitates for words, but she overcomes any apparent imperfection in her speaking by the earnestness of her manner and the quality of her thoughts. She is a superior woman, and it is useless to deny it, however much we may differ with her on the subject of emigration. She obtained the floor and proceeded to and succeeded in making one of the most convincing and telling speeches in favor of Canadian immigration I have ever heard. She had first had 10 minutes granted to her, as had the other members. At their expiration, 10 more were granted. And by this time came the hour of adjournment. But so interested was the House that it granted her additional time to finish at the commencement of the afternoon session. And the House was crowded and breathless in its attention to her masterly exposition of our present condition and the advantages Canada opens to colored men of enterprise. Herein consisted the charm and potency of her speech. And I love this description of Mary Ann Shadd Cary hailing a stagecoach in Manhattan because it speaks to her dynamism and the obstacles she faced on a quotidian basis as she pursued her activist agenda. It's thanks to journalists like Wilson that we have a sense of what Shadd Cary was like in person and how truly formidable she was. Within his article, we see the potential for Mary Ann Shadd Cary's radical Black feminist politics to play out in physical space and time. For me, Wilson's description also hints at the way that Canada might have allowed Shadd Cary to form a particular brand of queer Black feminist activism. My understanding of Shadd Cary is also driven by Jose Munoz's and by extension Elizabeth McHenry's theorization of queer failure as an important analytic concept. Munoz understands queerness as a forward-looking mode of critique that can allow outsiders to revel in the margins. His definition of queer failure as a rejection of normative protocols of canonization and value speaks directly to the position of Mary Ann Shadd Cary within the 19th century literary world. Here, queer failure is a brilliant offness, but is not so much a failure to succeed as a failure to participate in a system of valuation that is predicated on exploitation and conformity. She was phenomenal, but her career was not one defined purely by Black excellence, and those failures tend to be admirable in my estimation. Sometimes Mary Ann Shadd Cary failed spectacularly in her chosen fields, but she remained undeterred. Perhaps the most telling example of her determination to persevere in the face of failure and despite the odds can be found in her first pamphlet, Hints to the Colored People of the North. It appeared in 1849 when she was only 25 years old. And the pamphlet has its origins in a letter to Frederick Douglass's North Star about the lives of free Blacks in the North, taking the Black community's central political institution, the Black Church, to task by excoriating its clergy for being corrupt, sapping our every means, and inculcating ignorance as a duty. Her letter to the editor was published in the March 23rd, 1849 edition of the North Star, and also formed part of her self-published 12-page pamphlet, Hints to the Colored People of the North. Teresa Zakodnik reminds us that Hints had already been promoted by Black nationalist Martin Delany prior to its publication in early 1849, when in his January 16, 1849 letter to the North Star, published in the column In the Lecturing Field, he wrote of convening meetings in Wilmington, Delaware, December 25th through the 30th, 1848, at which Shadd rose to declare that the subject on which he spoke was the very food for which the people's minds in Wilmington were starving to death. Delany then noted that she was the author of a pamphlet now in press on the elevation of her people, which he had the pleasure of examining in manuscript and takes pleasure in recommending as a creditable production. He wrote that hints would be available at the bookstore and the anti-slavery offices of G.W. Goines on 198 South 6th Avenue in Philadelphia, and also at the grocery store of A.J. Williams on Front Street in Wilmington, Delaware. 4 months later, Douglas published a letter to the editor dated April 23, 1849, and signed J.B.Y. from Philadelphia, that offered a review of sorts and excerpts from Shadd's hints, while bemoaning that the press had offered it neither recognition nor mention of it. Describing the pamphlet, J.B.Y. reported that very little money has been paid for it, and that some readers said, had they known that the work contained some things which it does, they would not have had it as a gift, which remains one of the funniest review lines I've ever read from the North Star. This pamphlet was an unabashed failure, but Shadd Cary insisted on the right to be heard in person as well as in print. We know that the criticism she faced took particular issue with her willingness to transgress gender boundaries in public. Throughout her life, Mary Ann Shadd Cary occupied the outer limits of nationhood and gender. She was not invested in the respectability politics that were so important to Black political leaders during the period, and she paid a price for it. But what do her gender politics have to do with space and nationhood? In a practical sense, as one of the few Black feminist speakers in antebellum political life, Mary Ann Shadd Cary frequently crossed the U.S.-Canadian border to give lectures, and her listeners were not equally pleased. Carla Peterson notes that Mary Ann Shadd Cary's speeches were often perceived not only as impertinent, but impertinent and unfeminine, and her speaking style led even those who appreciated the subject of her lectures to label her delivery as nervous and hurried. Her insistence on the right to be heard in public courted controversy. Jane Rose explains that while Black Americans seem to encourage and even require women's participation in the public sphere as necessary for racial progress during the antebellum period, Black women were expected to adhere to the cult of domesticity. And yet, while speaking out on stage and in the pages of the Provincial Freeman, Shadd Cary was no angel of the house. She consistently ran afoul of gendered expectations, which insisted upon Black women's silence, subservience, and respectability. Her literary pursuits certainly put her at odds with 19th century gender norms. In contrast to the rampant sexism of North American public discourse, the early issues of the Provincial Freeman established the paper as a forum for Shadd Cary's growing interest in women's rights, especially within the context of anti-slavery and other reform movements. Bouncing between cities like Windsor, Chatham, and Toronto, Ontario, in the Provincial Freeman, Shadd Cary frequently reprinted material by feminist abolitionists, including a speech by Harriet Beecher Stowe, an appeal to the women of the free states of America on the present crisis of our country. Unlike her famed plea for immigration, Shadd Cary's newspaper contained an early assemblage of feminist discourse that was intersectional and drew few cultural distinctions between Canada and the U.S. I'm only being a little facetious when I say that Mary Ann Shadd Cary's willingness to transgress boundaries and subvert gender expectations was queer/queer. The US-Canadian border is a 5,525-mile long figurative line that has meant very real freedom for some, for the fugitives who fled slavery before the Civil War, and the refugees seeking asylum there today. Theorizing the US-Mexico border, Gloria Anzaldúa writes that borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. But the US-Canadian border often fails at that task. My colleague Catherine McKittrick has shown that for Black Canadians, such nation borders are called into question because they do not sufficiently speak to the ways in which Black geographies in Canada are made and upheld. Inhabitants of these borderlands often have a pragmatic approach to citizenship and nationhood. When I consider Mary Ann Shadd Cary's relationship to the liminal space of the US-Canadian border in Canada itself, I'm struck by the way their pragmatism also extended to gender and sexuality. And I don't mean to say that Mary Ann Shadd Cary understood herself as queer in a practical sense in any one given moment. But in a contemporary sense, we might say she was. And we have the privilege of hindsight, contemporary discourse, and archival methods to allow us to understand her as such and to discover her in new ways. The title of my new volume, Insensible of Boundaries, is in fact drawn from a line in an evocative letter written to Frederick Douglass, in which Mary Ann writes that in anything relating to our people, she was insensible of boundaries. And in that letter, we get an inkling of the strength of her political motivations and her prose. For me, it signifies the centrality of reinvention, renewal, playfulness, and subversiveness to Black intellectual history and praxis. And Mary Ann Shadd Cary is perhaps the same as she always was, but thanks to the work that is proliferating right now, some of which is actually included in this new volume, we're beginning to know her and her many facets a bit better. Insensible of Boundaries is also a gesture towards the way that the spirit of collaboration and innovation is embedded in my work. This volume was developed in part through my collaboration with the Center for the Black Digital Research, including a symposium that was held in fall 2021. With the help of my colleagues at the Center for Black Digital Research, I have also fostered conversations with Archives Ontario about the permanent acquisition of the Mary Ann Shadd Cary fonds. And I think of this as an example of the way that Mary Ann Shadd Cary has directly impacted our collective methodologies. Such collaborations hold public engagement, openness, and accessibility as central values. Our aim has always been to foster further conversations and new work. The publication of this volume, my hope is that we'll see an even greater resurgence of scholarship, art, and performance that testifies to Mary Ann Shadd Cary's deep and lasting impact on Black culture. And I think I'll end there and just leave it open to questions so that we can talk a little bit more about the genesis of this special volume and anything else related to Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. My hand hurts from writing down all of the great observations you shared with us. I mean, one of the things that really struck me in what you were sharing was about maybe the relationship between oral and written culture that Mary Ann Shadd Cary exists within. And I love, the way in which maybe her queerness is kind of played out through those. It's interesting to have what feels like very different estimations of her speaking ability, right? I think the Wilson quote kind of gives us her on the stage, but then you reference kind of Carla Peterson's work saying nervous and so how do you, as kind of a literary scholar, think about that? Do we think that she's using her own kind of oral techniques in different environments to do different things, or is that are there some just activists who are better written than oral? I guess. I mean, I'm so curious. I'd love to just have you, kind of meditate a little bit more on that in her work.
Yeah, I mean, some of the reaction to her public speaking is so strong that it's difficult to understand it outside of the concept of sexism and racism. She was just the fact that she wanted to be on stage was just so deeply offensive to male listeners across a wide spectrum. And so one of the interesting things, again, about Shadd Cary in that way is that she kind of doesn't care. And I think it really speaks to some of her upbringing, right? The insistence really from an early age that she was supposed to be an active part of this abolitionist discourse, and that it was actually worth it maybe to go through some of that public criticism if it meant that it would provide her with a platform to participate in those discourses and really begin to hash out some of her ideas. I think it's kind of wonderful, right, that she develops this lifelong friendship with Samuel Delany, right from the earliest phases of her activism. And he recognizes in her public speech, right, that she has these really strong ideas and that something really significant is happening here, even if nobody else wants it, right? Literally, people are like, I wouldn't even take this book for free. But, Delany is like, actually, we really need to pay attention to this moment.
That's wonderful. And before we turned on the camera, we were talking about the fact that hints to the colored people in the North, this failure work doesn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, does not exist anymore in a known copy. Is that correct? And
Yeah.
I guess I put this out there for any of you who work in libraries to look for a copy. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of wonderful that we know what it contains because of Delaney's sort of review of her speech and his mention of it in the North Star. We have follow-ups by JBY, and he also includes excerpts from the pamphlet. But as far as we know, there are no extant copies of Hints to Colored People of the North. And again, it's a pretty significant piece of writing. It's published by this 25-year-old Black woman in the early part of the 19th century, at a time when it would have been, kind of incredible for her just to not focus on her own upbringing, her own life. It's not really a piece of biographical writing. It's specifically political criticism. I mean, she's criticizing some of the leaders of the biggest institutions of the time. It's like, who is she? Why does she think that she should be empowered to do this? But she carries that energy with her, right, throughout her life.
Well, hopefully a copy will sometime emerge in our lifetimes, and we'll get to see kind of materiality. I want to just say how much I appreciate your more thinking about materiality of the text and the world that she lives in.
Yeah, it would be incredible to know who she chose to publish it with, right, and why. And one of the cool things about being able to head over to Mackenzie House in Toronto and talk to them is that they're also invested in 19th century print culture. And, they found really amazing things in terms of the way Mary Ann Shadd Cary actually literally just organized her print shop. And so compared to other journalists and other printers who were operating in Toronto at the time, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, I think, had a much more ethical and kind approach to giving workers in a print shop things like holidays, right? In comparison to other folks who were her contemporaries, like Mackenzie King, or William Lyon Mackenzie. So we have some really interesting examples of what it can mean to choose a printer, to perhaps choose a Black printer. I don't know that she did. It would be fascinating to know if she did, but then also understanding that later in life she would try to incorporate some of her own feminist principles and just a sense of ethical activism into the way that she organized her print shop has been, incredible to learn.
So we've got a question in the Q&A from Sue Remick. And Sue asks, were there any sort of anecdotal surprises to you that you found in looking at Shadd Cary's correspondence with other women?
Yeah, it maybe shouldn't be so surprising, but even some of the personal correspondence that she has with relatives from the United States, people who are not necessarily major players or sort of, notable outside of that context, outside of a sort of a family context, were political. So they talk about people who were trying to escape and people who were refugees from slavery and people who were fleeing the US really openly. And, they share information and they think about folks who may have, sort of escaped moments of recapture. That was just a really significant part of Black people's lives that they lived along the border at that time. And I think that it shouldn't be surprising, but the tone of those letters is actually quite striking, right?
How are those letters accessible to scholars today? I mean, do you have to sort of go to the archives collection in Ontario, or?
You make it to Toronto, you can visit Archives Ontario. It's a lovely institution. It's free and open to the public. Anybody can go in. You sign up at the front, and even if you aren't a scholar. And so, one of the wonderful things about the fact that those papers have recently been donated to the archives is that they're now, they're open to the public, they're accessible to everyone. And very recently, thanks to the work of archivists like Sean Smith at Archives Ontario, those papers have become registered with CC UNESCO. So they are recognized as a part of Canada's national heritage, but they are also accessible to anybody who wants to go in and sit down with them and read them. And it's really fascinating. I mean, she was, she was a small business owner, and so she kept a little bit of everything. You have, receipts that are related to her business, as well as really personal letters, incredible letters between Shadd Cary and major figures like William Still. There is so much to be learned and still so much to be analyzed in terms of those materials. And I do think that it's going to be a little bit easier for people now that you can go and consult the papers in person and not just in terms of digital format and microfilm.
Another question here in the Q&A. This comes from Rick Taylor. And he asks, did Shadd Cary interact with Samuel Ringgold Ward when he fled to Canada?
Absolutely. In preparation for the talk, I was rereading Jane Rhodes' biography. So she gets really into the nitty-gritty of Shadd Cary's relationship with all of those sort of early Black settlers to Canada, and the way in which sometimes those relationships got very tense, right? She, much like she was as a 25-year-old sort of upstart in Philadelphia, she was also really openly critical of the way that some of those early Black settlements were being run, and critical of some of the kind of I would say like the patriarchal nature, right, of the sort of funding model between some of the refugee organizations and the settlers. And so very quickly that causes her to sort of rub up against people who I think she originally kind of had an affinity with, like Samuel Ringgold Ward. Absolutely, those people were absolutely involved in her publishing ambitions. But those friendships and relationships also become fraught over time because she is so outspoken. Sometimes when I read her takes on things, I'm like, maybe she wasn't right. But the thing that was great about it is that she was using her public platform as a way to kind of hash out those ideas and to consider what they might mean. And that wasn't a freedom that was afforded to many people, never mind women at that time. So yes, absolutely. She did interact with Samuel Ringgold Ward, and those interactions definitely fed into let's say her ambitions in terms of journalism and publication.
See a fascinating world that she's existing in that's about activism, but also about denominational affiliations. And I believe she was born Catholic. Ward, of course, was a kind of on again, off again congregational minister, kind of more active in the 30s and 40s. Is there a story, do you think, about her own kind of religious identity or her involvement in religious networks?
It's funny because some of the things that would make Mary Ann Shadd Cary, I think, exciting and appealing to me are deeply connected to her own sense of religion. And so I don't know enough to say that there are certain aspects of her political practice that we could think of as being specifically Catholic. But when I think of her involvement in things like the temperance movement, and when we think perhaps of some of the material that is held in archives, like the Moreland Spingarn archives at Howard, in which she has handwritten copies of hymns, right, and also temperance songs, we can see that being close to religion and close to religious institutions remains important to her, even as she critiques them, right?
So the question here of the Underground Railroad, which you talked about, such a seemingly formative part of her family life, her early life. Did Shadd Cary write or speak about the Underground Railroad and her family's stories in her publications?
Yeah, so much of her work in the Provincial Freeman is sort of is distanced from her because she has to hide her involvement in the paper and her editorship. So she doesn't necessarily come out and say, I'm Mary Ann Shadd Cary. This is the incredible abolitionist family legacy that I'm a part of. And now I'm going to tell you all about the amazing things that my mom was doing to help people as they were fleeing and they were staying in our house. And I'm going to tell you all about the way that my father encouraged all of the women in our family to become educated and to be political leaders. Like she never fully comes out and says that. And so for me, that's what makes those archival records so interesting and important, right? We have really trained historians who have been able to go back and say, yes, specifically, these are the kinds of things that, let's say, Abraham Shadd did. Even when he moved to Canada, he became a really important Black political leader, one of the first, if not the first, Black man elected to a political position in Canada. Right, there are all sorts of incredible things that they're doing with the Underground Railroad, but she doesn't often speak about her own life and her own perspective very publicly. And I think that's because everything that she was interested in doing was so deeply embedded in the abolitionist movement, in political movements, eventually, right, in things like allowing Black women to vote. That's really where a lot of her public writing and activism comes out. She herself is not really that interested in, I would maybe commodifying herself or putting herself out in front in that way and thinking about herself as a person of interest for the public. What a lot of what we know about her comes from a biography written by her daughter. And so her daughter really takes on that role of chronicling her family's history, thinking about them from a distance in that way. But Mary Ann Shadd Cary was just so deeply devoted to political activism that that doesn't really often come out, I think, in terms of her writing. It's very rare. Right. She wanted she wanted Black people to be free. That was, if it wasn't about Black freedom, then that's kind of, sort of where things got a little bit boring for her.
I think maybe some of our virtual audience is thinking as you were just kind of talking about how she centers her own self in this practice, maybe a distinction from Sojourner Truth, right, where we've seen kind of fascinating scholarship on the way in which she was selling images of herself and kind of crafting a persona that was part of her political work. Is that a fair, kind of point of departure that, Shadd Cary took a different approach, maybe?
It's a fascinating comparison because there are people who are both, so let's say, operating before the Civil War at a time in which photography is also doing really interesting things. And you have somebody like Sojourner Truth, who's really able to make a living off of selling these cartes de visite and also thinking about how her own life history and story can help to support her and be circulated, is still part of a religious and sort of Black freedom discourse, but really something practical that helps her. We have one photograph of Mary Ann Shadd Cary. That's it. She just wasn't interested in that. And she is somebody, right, who had access to technology, but print culture. It's a little bit odd, actually, that there aren't other sorts of graphic representations of her. And I would like to say that part of that speaks to the kinds of values and emphasis that she placed, right, on being in public. People already, were shocked that she was in public. They wrote about how terrible, how wonderful, how shocking it is all the time. Maybe she just felt as if she didn't need to represent herself photographically or in that way. But yeah, that's an interesting comparison for sure.
One of the many things that I love about this volume is that you're bringing together a range of different sort of approaches and ways of thinking about Shadd Cary, right? So for all of you in Zoom land, when you buy your copy, you're going to see that there's a section on Black digital humanities, there's a section on arts-based research and sort of Black creative work. There's a section on Black feminist activism, right? So this is not maybe your kind of traditional, one person took, the years when she was in law school and another person took a chapter on some other historical component. And I wonder, especially if you might talk a little bit about kind of how arts-based research can be used to illuminate the histories of figures like Shadd Cary. What is the potential, and maybe maybe this is how do you kind of convince the folks in the history department in your university to maybe think beyond more traditional approaches to reconstructing and understanding the significance of historic figures?
I think one of the wonderful things about the genesis of this book is that it was really sort of ushered through the Center for Black Digital Humanities. And I was able to work alongside, as you mentioned, a broad range of scholars coming from a wide variety of interdisciplinary backgrounds, including people like Nika Denny, who was a historian. And it was a very different take on Shadd Cary's kind of materials and what that might mean and how we can interpret them. When I think about reading newspaper articles that are written about Shadd Cary or thinking about the context of the articles that she chose to reprint, my approach to those things are very different than a historian. And I think that being in constant conversation, right, having public symposiums, that also include things like performances, really, really help to just sort of shift the context and methodology in that way. So in some ways, it just became a natural part of the evolution of this volume to think about the fact that somebody like Mary Ann Shadd Cary is interesting and necessary for scholars who are working across a wide variety of disciplines and who are interested in Black feminism. Right? I feel confident saying now, even though I don't know how much more I can do with her right now, that everybody should know about her, right? There is something of value for everybody when it comes to thinking about what this strange, um, radical Black feminist was doing in the middle of the 19th century. It still doesn't make sense to me that she was so outspoken and so driven in terms of writing, right? But she was.
Thank you to you and your contributors for doing this work and for really kind of getting, continuing to get the push out there for us to understand more about her. I'm curious, this is a work, and hers is a life that straddles a boundary, right? You talked quite wonderfully in this talk about that. What would you say, just over the last 5 years or 10 years, what are the greatest challenges and the biggest payoffs of trying to bring scholars who are on either side of a boundary together?
Um, what is the big, I mean, one of the things that happened in a really practical sense at the beginning of this work is that, we were challenged by the COVID pandemic. And so the original symposium that was supposed to lead to the genesis of this collection was canceled. It was supposed to take place in April 2020. And so I would say actually in some ways, being able to bring people together in smaller formats, in online meetings, perhaps actually benefited the project, right? There are different ways in which you were able to sort of revisit a conversation and to develop scholarly relationships with people over Zoom, or we were able to do that during the pandemic in ways that perhaps we hadn't planned for. So it was disappointing that we were not able to meet in person in 2020, but as a result, I think that sort of cross-border work actually became facilitated by, through technology like Zoom. I think that the things that we've achieved maybe would not have been possible without our reliance on Zoom. Right. I was always connecting with people from the Center for Black Digital Humanities by Zoom. I teach at a Canadian institution, although, at least before the pandemic, I would travel back and forth fairly often. But actually being able to just regularly convene meetings with all of the stakeholders involved in this project, including archivists and, sort of behind the scenes conversations that were never published, right? Just conversations about what it might mean to, have all of these materials digitized and eventually made public, right? Those things, those kinds of conversations just became a natural part of the work that we did together. And again, I think that it contributed to that sense of us as scholars moving beyond boundaries and outside of our disciplinary silos. It was always going to be interdisciplinary, and it was always going to be a sort of a cross-boundary effort.
By way of a final question, there's one other thing that I think is so wonderful in the work that you're doing is the recognition and the involvement of descendant family historians in doing this work. I wonder if you could just maybe talk a little bit about the role, the contributions that they have to play, because I do think sometimes academic scholars have a tendency to privilege certain types of source material and allow certain types of interlocutors at the table and not others. So how is our understanding of Shadd Cary richer by involving family historians and descendant historians?
Again, the Shadd Cary papers have such an interesting history because they were found on a piece of family property that Shadd Cary used to live on, in which her descendants actually eventually took over. And they are the ones responsible for the fact that we have these papers today. And I think that, the fact that both Maxine and Ed Robbins, the family members who found those papers, are educators. They both became school administrators. They're both really, really invested in what it means to think about Black history in that area, is so critical to this conversation. We would not be able to be doing this work without their advocacy for those papers and their understanding that they were important. And also their generosity, right? The recognition that, now is actually a really good time to think about what it might mean to digitize these papers and donate it to Archives Ontario. They are not scholars in the sense that they are, working closely with institutions or publishing, but they are deeply invested in education and making sure that that kind of Black history is open and accessible to all sorts of people around Ontario. It would be hard for me also to, I'm, it would be hard, like maybe getting choked up. It'd be hard for me also to close without mentioning that the work that is being done and has been done by independent Black historians and Black writers in the Chatham area of Ontario is also a really huge part of this work. There are so many folks who just grew up in that area, are descendants of some of the people who settled in the 19th century, but who understand immediately, right, the importance of some of that history. And then also, again, some of the challenges, right? So Chatham in that area is, home to some of the earliest examples of Black settlements in Canada. That doesn't mean that Black folks who live there didn't experience racism. And so, we have such a complex set of knowledge that's coming out of that area that it is really incredible. You know, yeah, there's truly no way that this work could have been done without the involvement of family members like Ed and Maxine Robbins. But there are generations, right, and new generations of independent Black historians and scholars from the Chatham area who are really, really just crucial to the preservation and the interpretation of Black history in Canada.
A wonderful recognition of those who've done it before, but also those who will carry on, right? Those who will keep and amplify even more the contributions of Mary Ann Shadd Cary and how many other individuals that we're not studying that we should be studying.
Exactly. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, everyone.